Well, hello and welcome to Atrainability Radio with me, Trevor Dale. Today we're going to welcome Dr. Andy Knox, another speaker from TEDx NHS 2019. Andy is a general practitioner based in the northwest of England. He's looking at our way of working in healthcare and the impact of massive health inequalities across the UK. Andy focuses on the culture that's needed to develop together in order to create real wellness within our communities. This matches well with the recent GMC paper on caring for doctors, caring for patients. We're going to discuss that with him. Andy trained as a doctor in Manchester, England, and worked in various hospitals across the city before training eventually as a general practitioner. He's now an executive GP for Lancashire North Clinical Commissioning Group and works with the Better Care Together team for Morecambe Bay. So his particular area of interest is health and well-being, and as a qualified facilitator, he likes to host and facilitate conversations about reimagining regions and cities as healthy places and challenging the status quo and reimagining the future. So how are you this morning?
Good, thank you. Yeah, really good.
Thanks ever so much for doing this. Absolutely brilliant. And really enjoyed your TED Talk. And of course, the basic premise on which you're based, which I think is, the whole thing about wellness. So if we sort of start off in it, thanks, Andy, for sharing your perspective on the whole thing around wellness. And particularly, I noted that you were talking about the high self-harm and suicide rate amongst doctors, which is, and burnout in general, a number that are leaving the profession because they've really stressed out. And we see it a lot because we're often asked to go in and do consultancy work in places where there is a problem. But it would be good to hear you, just if you could give an outline of your TED Talk.
Yeah, so I started by looking at for me, the philosophical battle that's led to us being where we are. And for me, kind of in 19th century France, the difference in opinion between Louis Pasteur and Antoine Béchamp, as great thinkers in the academic world, has shaped Western medicine for the last 150 years. And basically Pasteur, who did his brilliant work around pasteurization, his philosophy was we need to kill disease and we need to prevent disease in order to remain well. So it became very, very disease focused, very much about dealing with the problem as it arises. And we've had some amazing things happen as a result of that. Without Pasteur's philosophy, we wouldn't have mass immunization. We wouldn't have had the advent of antibiotics or the development of chemotherapy and the ways that we can do some absolutely fundamentally brilliant things, right? But Béchamp, they really properly fell out over this. And he said that actually what we really need to do is create environments that help people to be well. Because if you don't, and I think there are great studies that show that, the work that's been done on rats over time and heroin addiction and all kinds of different things, the environment in which we're brought up and the things that we experience in life have a massive bearing on how well we are. So if you look, for example, at the effects of adverse childhood experiences on the risk to health later on and the risk of IV drug addiction and the risk of suicide and the risk of incarceration, you look at the effects of poverty or poor housing on respiratory health, on cardiac disease, on mental health. They're absolutely massive. But we in the NHS and through the way that we've designed our healthcare systems focus hugely on responding to issues rather than proactively creating environments that help us to be well. So even the way that we design our cities, even the way that we design our education system, we end up then becoming reactive to what we have caused rather than thinking about how we can create the kind of environments together that enable every person to flourish, and how we are left with such massive health inequalities and social injustices. And that becomes very, very overwhelming. And I think that is why we are seeing so much burnout in the medical profession, is there's just this sense of overwhelm. How the heck do we begin to face into the amount of stuff that's coming through our doors and the issues that we're facing? We can't fix them. And that is a very disheartening feeling when you've gone to medical school or nursing school and you're told you're a fixer. So you spend your life trying to fix people, and then you just see the problems getting bigger, and that becomes very demoralizing. And that's why I've wanted to take a much more positive step to think about how do we build wellness? How do we create environments together? How do we reimagine a future together that is less reactive and more proactive in how we think about healthcare and how we think about our roles as healthcare professionals within that?
I find that fascinating, and it reminds me of two things. One was Einstein's comment about never trying to teach people, but trying to provide the conditions in which they can learn. And that fits pretty well with this, isn't it? Because, there's a big argument about, can you change people's behavior? Not really. They've got to want to change. So for me, it's, education in one form or another is at the root of all this. And the other point I think that struck me, where it ties in with what we do around wellness, is people tend to think very much of physical wellness, but obviously what you're talking about is much more psychological and emotional wellness. So the sort of the 3-bucket principle, I guess.
Yeah, I think maybe even deeper than that. I think I'm talking about environmental wellness. I think I'm talking about the wellness of communities and social wellness. So for me, it's a lot of our well-being is about our interconnectedness. It's about community. We see the huge rise in loneliness, and we're saying now, and the World Health Organization is saying that loneliness is as dangerous as smoking to a person's health. Smoking currently in Morecambe Bay is the single biggest killer. If we were to look at all the different things that people die from, the single biggest attributable cause of death in Morecambe Bay is currently smoking. But I wonder if we applied loneliness in the same way. I think that we have such a breakdown of community, and we've become so divided and so separate. I think, you look at what's going on in our political debate at the moment and how divided we've become in our communities, and some of the dangerous rhetoric that's rising again, and the kind of hate crimes that we're seeing and the division back in our society. It makes us unwell. And I think we measure wellness sometimes according to how long people are living, without thinking about the quality of that life and how interconnected that life is and how sustainable it is for the future. And I heard, I can't remember who said this actually, but I was hearing someone recently saying, I think it's David Attenborough actually, he said, we need to ask ourselves what kind of ancestors we are becoming.
Now, that's an interesting one. 2 points. One is, my wife told me last night that our 13-year-old granddaughter is convinced there will be a nuclear war.
Wow.
Which is I'm considerably older than you, and I lived through the 50s, and I was born in 1950. So the 50s and 60s, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, and everyone prepared to duck under the table in case a bomb went off. It was very tangible in those days. And the other thing that strikes me, I don't know if you travel a lot, but I've always traveled a great deal. You look at other countries. We go to Italy every year, and they have a very tight sense of community. And they all look after their old people. And at the risk of being very controversial in England, all the kids are well behaved. You don't get kids running around and arguing, nothing remotely like what you get in this country. So this, as you say, this sense of community, I wonder how much it is peculiarly British. I don't know if you have an opinion.
One of the things that has most struck me and most changed my way of thinking and working over the last few years has been to get involved in something called the art of hosting. I mentioned it very briefly in my TED Talk. And it actually flowed out of a conversation that the Queen of Denmark started with her own country about 15 years ago. And she said to the people of Denmark, we need to face the reality that our place in the world has changed. And she said, what is the future of Denmark that we want to create together? What is our dream and our hope and our vision for this country? And I think we are not brilliant at a country at recognizing that we have become quite small in the world. And I don't mean that means that we're ineffective or don't have an important role to play. But we're not an empire anymore. And colonialism is over. And actually, so is Christendom. What we need to face up to is, what is the future of our country? How do we rebuild? What is, I write a blog called Reimagining the Future and another one, Reimagining Health. What is our corporate imagination of how we're going to be together in the future. What do we want to prioritize, and what are we going to stop? How are we going to change things? How are we going to do this? And I don't think the answers lie in top-down hierarchical power. I think they lie in grassroots community and people together beginning to dream of and create the kind of future that we believe and want to have together. So, one of the things that I often do is go and sit with communities and say, so what are our dreams and our hopes for this place? And I believe that we need to create a real new sense of hope together in our communities. One of the things I talk about again in the TED Talk is, and how do we do that? And I think one of the things that I've really loved, partly through the art of hosting and through others, is getting to grips with something called appreciative inquiry.
Yep.
Let's start on what's amazing about this place. There is so much that we can focus on in our communities that is awful and wrong, and we hear all the fear and the terror stories every day in the press, and it feels doom and gloom and everything's going to be chaotic and awful. But that, as Martin Luther King said, evil only prospers when good people do nothing. I think the onus is on all of us to begin to change the conversation. And one of the things that's most excited me in my work is to get communities together and hold a space for a reimagining of the future. And you touched on Einstein a minute ago. One of the other things that Einstein is, well, he's said to have said, I don't know whether he was the one that actually said this. He said that if we had 60 minutes to save the whole world, we should spend 55 minutes trying to work out what the question is that we're trying to answer. The answer comes in 5 minutes. And I think we've become so quick to look for answers. We rush off and we do it, and we spend a huge amount of money and an inordinate amount of time wasting ourselves on things that are not going to give us the future that we long for or we need together. And I think there's something to take a step back and really learn some humility and learn to sit with our communities differently and say, so what's amazing about this place and what's amazing about our communities that we can build on together, and how might we have more of it? And what would our dreams be and our hopes be for this place? Because what I find when we sit and we talk with communities, they don't want health inequality. They don't want division. They don't want racism or hate, nuclear war. They don't want powerlessness. They don't want very little choice over what they can eat or obesity. Actually, people have huge dreams and visions around how we could live better together, around work that really flourishes, around the kind of education system that hugely invests in our young people's health and well-being and their mental health. That people are not short of dreams and ideas and visions and hopes. What if we concede hope that people can together build social change? And I think if you look at the history of the last 200 years particularly, nearly every major change that's happened has come through the power of social movement. And we're nowhere near where we need to be still in terms of feminism and in terms of women's rights, but we're a lot further than we were 120 years ago. Civil rights movement, or you look at what's happened with the LGBTQI movement, or, again and again, it's been about people power. It's the same with Greta and her amazing ability to just sit outside her school with a sign. And now suddenly we've got, millions of people across the globe saying we need to be better stewards of our environment. Let's have a whole conversation about that. And it's putting pressure on the government. And governments are beginning to change because of people power, not the other way around. And I think that should give huge hope to communities. And that's what makes us well. Even in that process, it begins to make us well because it begins to connect us. It begins to build relationship. It begins to put love back into the heart of our conversations together and build the future on different principles and different foundations. And for me, that becomes very, very exciting.
Well, I absolutely agree with you. And coincidentally, I was at a small emergency medicine conference yesterday in University Hospital Birmingham, where along came Alison Jones, I think, talking about appreciative inquiry. And of course, I know Adrian Plunkett and Suzette Woodward and the whole thing, but it helped me a lot yesterday because although I know the basics of it and I've been using it in our training for quite a while, it was good to have a sort of refocus and some practical thoughts about it. Because you're right, this whole thing about joy and also about criticism. Everyone looks, all the fine talk about just culture and, I know you've helped turn around Morecambe Bay phenomenally. But people still are quick to blame on an individual basis and all the rest. And if we can look instead for let's call it, I talk about 99% of the time things go well, but you don't talk about it, you just take it for granted.
Yeah.
and it's if you like, what I'm trying to focus on with a lot of this whole podcast series thing is, what can people take away, if you like, a practical something they can do different themselves on an individual basis, which builds pressure, as you say. And I think, I'd like to hand it back to you, but I think the appreciative inquiry and the authentic praise, if you like, and accepting it, which people don't do, they don't accept genuine praise, shrug, just doing my job. It's so frustrating sometimes. Yeah, I think so. But also, we make a lot of assumptions about what we believe people need. And because, I'm a commissioner as well as being a doctor, and I think that we often sit around our boardrooms and we look at stats and we look at figures and we look at data, but we often don't really listen to our communities and what's going on with them. And I think appreciative inquiry is great, but I also don't think it's enough. No. And one of the things that's really, really changed my entire practice has been the Poverty Truth Commission. I touch on it when I'm talking about inclusivity and the need to include people in the conversations about the future and how we bring around real change. And I think there's, a huge amount of work going on around this in terms of asset-based community development and really involving communities in the change they want to see and be part of. But one of the things that I think we have to learn to do far more is really, really learn to deeply listen. And I don't know if we even know how to do it. It's another thing that the art of hosting really trains you in, is to get into what they call theory U and the deeper levels of listening, where it becomes really about generative listening, where I have a friend who's currently writing a PhD on conversation. And conversation actually has the same root word in the Greek as conversion. And I believe if we're going to genuinely have conversations with our communities, that we must deeply listen to each other enough that we can both be changed in the process and both face the future differently together. If I'm going to talk to a community with an entrenched perspective or idea, and I'm not myself willing to be fundamentally changed by what I hear and what I see and what I witness and what I experience, I'm not really willing to enter into a conversation. And one of the things that come through the Poverty Truth Commission, it kind of came out of, the idea came out of the rebuilding of South Africa after the horrors of apartheid. And they had, the mantra, nothing about us without us is for us. And the Scottish Poverty Truth Commission took that on, and then it came to Leeds, and now it's come to Morecambe Bay, and it's now in, I think, 14 different locations across the UK. And the whole premise is this, that people who live in poverty have expertise in poverty that I have no idea about because I've never lived in it. Rather than me making assumptions of what it's like to live in poverty, I actually need to allow people who live in poverty to genuinely change my heart and my perspective. And so what happens in the Poverty Truth Commission is, you get together a group of people in an area, a bunch of leaders who say, yeah, this would be a good idea. Let's find some funding for this. And then you employ someone who takes the time to build relationships with people who live with significant poverty of different sorts. And they then spend several months building relationships together and learning to trust each other and tell their stories. And they then, on their own terms and in their own way, invite people in positions of power to come to their own event where they tell their stories and they tell us the experiences of what it's like. And the Poverty Truth Commission here in Lancaster, they hosted a thing at the town hall. They said, the town hall belongs to the people, and we want to tell our stories in this town hall to the people of power and wealth and influence. And there was not one dry eye in the house. It was such a powerful event. 150 different leaders from across the area came together. And we sat, and it was so impactful to recognize some of the decisions we've made on behalf of these communities and the detrimental and profoundly negative effects that they've had. And we've saved a bit of money, but the human cost to some of those decisions has been absolutely huge. And what's been beautiful is then they then invited some of us to become co-commissioners with them. And together, we're now thinking about how do we design the services that really work for people living in some of these estates, or people who are living in street homeless, or refugees, asylum seekers coming into our city. How do we work together? And so we have done some really, really deep listening, built some fantastic, not just relationships, but now friendships. And together we're thinking about whole parts of the health system, or bits and pieces around DWP, or how the council acts and sends out letters
it's really beginning to have quite a profound impact on how we work together with our communities. It's taken us to a level of listening that we've never been to before, but it's also built some phenomenal relationships and trust back with the community. And we're finding, instead of us being the commissioners who do too, we're now co-commissioning and co-designing whole new parts of our system that really work for the people rather than doing things to them. And it's been an incredible change, actually.
Do you work alongside the voluntary sector then? I'm assuming you do. I've been in Lions clubs a long time, many years, and we like to get directly involved with people on that, but also, of course, Rotary Roundtable, Masons, all sorts of other organisations. But it's something, I live in what is apparently affluent stockbroker belt Surrey, but there are really profound examples of poverty within 200 yards of where I am right now. And I guess the same.
There are. Yeah, there is some profound poverty in Surrey. And actually, there was a national gathering of the Poverty Truth Commission recently. And some of our testifiers, community testifiers, we call them from this area, were utterly shocked by the levels of poverty in Surrey. I mean, far more profound, actually, than what they were experiencing here. And I think that's partly because there's so much privatisation of different stuff in Surrey around education, around a lot of healthcare and everything, that it's left people who really need the public services with very, very little left. The cuts have been deep, and some of the stuff that communities are experiencing in Surrey is absolutely pretty shocking, actually. But there are some great people in Surrey. Claire Fuller is doing some amazing work across the integrated care system and trying to bring things together and really talking about the issues of social justice, and I think changing the conversation remarkably across your county.
And the rest of the country, of course, as well. But so I don't want to get bogged down in Surrey, but far from it. But at time's passing, Andy, one thing I thought, I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but yesterday at this emergency medicine conference, I met a couple of guys, one of whom is Naushad Khan. And what he is looking at is working cooperatively with emergency medicine in a whole host of other countries, mostly across the sort of the South Asia continent, from Nepal through to India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, to work with their doctors to bring them over here, to upskill them, and then enable them to go back on a rolling basis. So we benefit and they benefit. And that's the thing he said to me that really hit me was, are we really Great Britain anymore? Because we should be Great Britain. And I hope I'm not saying the wrong thing if I point out that he is from an immigrant family originally himself, part of the Commonwealth, whatever. And I thought, it almost takes someone from outside to remind us of who we should be. And it seems to fit so well. Now, he was purely talking about emergency medicine. Matt Hancock, if you're listening, I'd like to come and talk to you about this and introduce you to him, or listen to him yourself. But it seemed to me to be, as as we both said, really something fundamental. Some guys are doing right at the sharp end to make a tangible difference, to help the community, to help us all. And I think that's great.
I absolutely love that. In fact, I think that we could expand that across all of the Royal Colleges. I actually wrote to the Department of Health and the Department for International Development a number of years ago to suggest a very, very similar scheme. We see significant times of bottlenecks in our certain professions, but there are also times when we're really, really short-staffed. And I think right across professions, in surgery, in medicine, in general practice, in physio, in nursing, I think we could be having incredible international schemes like this. Yeah. And I'm sad that they are doing this in emergency medicine, because we need it. And actually, it's an opportunity to really take some of the best learning that we have in Britain. And I think we have a phenomenal service here. So how do we gift that back? But how do we also learn from... So I think there's symbiosis. I don't think it's only that we do the teaching. We learn a lot about culture. We learn a lot of skills, new ways of thinking, new approaches. And I think the more we can develop those kind of symbiotic relationships, I would also love to see it flow both ways. So I think my personal preference would be not just that we bring people in to do learning to go home, but there's almost like an exchange program where actually we're sending some of our doctors or surgeons or nurses or whoever out to Sierra Leone, because if you think, I used to live and work in South Africa, And we've got the same size population, but we have 10 times the number of doctors that South Africa has. You know, when we think about how long you have to wait for an appointment with the doctor, we haven't got a clue. We think we're having a really hard time, but actually compared to the developing world, there is so much that we have to be grateful for, so much. And actually, if we could also see a dual swap program, that would be absolutely incredible, wouldn't it?
I totally agree. And Andy, I think we'd better wrap it up now, but thank you so much. I got a feeling we could keep talking here for quite a long time, but we might wear out the podcast. So maybe we could do this again sometime, and I'd like to keep in touch. But thank you for sharing your ideas. I think it's absolutely marvelous. You're doing a great job, and I should take up reading your blogs, I think, and I haven't done so far, and see what I can learn and hopefully share. So, Andy, thank you so much, and all the very best to you and your family.
You as well. Keep going. Thanks a million. Cheers.
Thanks, Andy. Bye now. Bye. Well, that was a real pleasure to speak to Andy Knox today, and I'm really grateful for Andy's time appearing as a guest on Atrainability Radio. And I hope that conversation will give you plenty to think about and hopefully share with some of your friends and colleagues as well. So that was a slightly different angle to what we've had in some of the other episodes. You can find the show notes for this episode at www.atrainability.co.uk. Just search for the episode with Andy Knox. And within those show notes, you can find useful links and other resources. Please do help spread the word about Atrainability Radio. Tell a friend, tell a colleague, and if you've not already done so, you can subscribe to this podcast in iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And so until next time, thank you for listening. I've been Trevor Dale, and this has been Atrainability Radio.